Welcome to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen and to the Artisan Lecture Series. I'm Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society. This program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, as well as the generous support of the Friends of the Artisan Lecture Series. We'd also like to thank the New York Landmarks Conservancy for their promotional support of this event. For those of you who this may be your first visit, the General Society was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of the city of New York. Today, this 230-year-old organization continues to serve the people of New York City through its educational and cultural program. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, which of course you're in this evening, and our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of course, which tonight continues in that proud tradition. The space you are in, as I mentioned, is the library. The library was founded in 1820. It's the second oldest library in New York City and one of the city's 3 remaining membership circulating libraries. And for those of you interested in finding out more, I'd like to mention you'll find information on library membership on the front registration table. Tonight, we gather to pay tribute to the art of craftsmanship. And this evening, architectural historian Gregory Dietrich will explore the work of Swedish architect Magnus E. Dahlander, who was born in 1862 and lived to 1951. He came to Brooklyn in 1888 and subsequently designed a stunning array of rowhouses, townhouses, and apartment buildings in Park Slope, Prospect Heights, Crown Heights North, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and Stuyvesant Heights, all between 1890 and 1896. So you can see he was very prolific in that period. Mr. Dietrich is a graduate of Columbia University's Historic Preservation and Real Estate Development programs. He has been working in the field of historic preservation for over 16 years. Since 2009, he has been the sole proprietor of Gregory Dietrich Preservation Consulting, where he has completed historical, architectural investigations, historic tax credit and grant applications, National Register nominations, consulting work. I beg your pardon, I missed a line. Let me start again. National Register nominations, preservation planning, and policy studies and cultural resource studies. In addition to his consulting work, he has served as an adjunct professor at FIT since 2008 and is regularly engaged as a guest speaker, tour guide, moderator, and panelist on a wide variety of preservation topics. It is my great pleasure to now introduce to you Gregory Dietrich.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for braving our very unpredictable weather. Before I get started, I did want to thank, of course, the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen for sponsoring this talk tonight, and especially Victoria Dengel and Karen Taylor for making it all happen. My interest in Magnus Dahlander, it's Swedish pronunciation, stemmed from 2 things. One was my father was a Swedish immigrant who came to the United States in 1938 to pursue his dream as a fine artist. So I was particularly interested in the idea of Swedes who basically leave everything behind to come here to make their mark. And secondly, through my professional surveys of Crown Heights North and Prospect Heights, which led to my discovery and interest in the work of Magnus Dahlander. Now, as everyone knows, especially if you are involved in the field of research, interest alone is never enough. And in fact, I was very fortunate to have the help of my American colleague, Suzanne Spellin, who put me in touch with a Swedish musicologist who had not only curated an exhibition of Dalander's work in Sweden, but had also, was also living in his hometown in Säter, Sweden, where the architect's archives are housed. So needless to say, this journey from Brooklyn to Sweden and back again has been quite fruitful. And I just want to note that this is Harold here, and we are standing in front of a very early 19th century hotel that Dahlander helped restore when he retired in his birthplace. And then here I am at the archives. And then over here, I'm standing in front of a grouping of attached, really what are mansions. I hesitate to even say townhouses. The scale of these houses are so large that Dahlander designed because after he spent his time in Brooklyn, he returned to Sweden and he served as the county architect to Örebro, which is both the county seat of the county of Örebro. So it was quite fascinating to also see his work there. In terms of tonight's presentation, I'd like to talk about, of course, focus on his time in Brooklyn, looking at his early life and education in Sweden and in Denmark, leading up to the time he went to Brooklyn. Also, look at 19th century Brooklyn, and more specifically, Swedes in Brooklyn during this time. His initial work as a draftsman, and then his subsequent work professionally as, both in partnership and on his own with his independent projects. And then finally, to be looking at the stylistic trends which would have informed his designs within the context of larger developments during the late 19th century. So who was Magnus Emile Dahlander? Well, he was born to a chemist and his wife in 1862 in Säter. He attended elementary school in Gothenburg, middle school in Stockholm, high school in Örebro. By the way, Örebro, just geographically, is about 120 miles west of Stockholm. He then did his architectural training at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, and then transferred to the Technical Skellskabs School and Academy of Art in Copenhagen. Following his time there, he returned to the Royal Institute, where he continued his postgraduate studies in architecture. And then in 1888, he moved to Brooklyn, and this was also the same year that he married Naomi Pettersson. So he returned to Sweden in 1896 after 8 years in Brooklyn, where he lived and worked the rest of his life until 1951. So in looking at the life, or I should say the work of Dahlander in Brooklyn during this period of time, I think it's helpful just to understand what were sort of the events that led up to his time there when he arrives in 1888. And for those of you who know Brooklyn history very well, and I know that there are people in this room that are far better than me in this area, I just wanted to give you sort of the highlights. 1814, with the establishment of Robert Fulton's steam-powered ferry service, which facilitates the transportation of passengers between Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, then leads to Brooklyn becoming a major suburb to New York, that is a commuter suburb with a widespread development of various neighborhoods throughout the borough. In 1833, Brooklyn incorporates as its own city, and it evolves into a major force for manufacturing, storage, and distribution, so that by the end of the 19th century, it is the third largest city in the United States. 1883, we have the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge. As you can see from the bird's eye view here by Currier and Ives, There was much anticipation. They did this illustration in 1879. The bridge was not yet completed. However, this was such a signal event because it not only signaled the physical connection between the first and third largest cities in the United States, but also the economic interdependence between the two. And then in 1898, as we know, the consolidation of the 5 boroughs into what now is modern-day New York, which was essentially the creation of an economic and cultural municipal superpower. But Brooklyn also has a long history of immigration. And by 1855, nearly half of its 205,000 residents were foreign-born, with nearly half of those foreign-born residents Irish, with nearly a quarter English and German as well. So beyond the widespread residential development in Brooklyn, facilitated by the ferry and the opening of the bridge, this immigrant influence resulted in a profusion of both churches and charitable institutions that sprung up throughout the borough, leading to Brooklyn being renowned as a city of homes and a city of churches. As early as 1836, the Swedes established the Svenska Societeten in New York to assist Swedish immigrants, as churches and other institutions were built in the ensuing years to serve their needs. And between 1860 and 1870, the population of Swedes in Brooklyn and New York went from 800 to around 3,000. I should say by 1891, there were nearly 20,000 Swedes living in Brooklyn alone. So this is actually a huge period of immigration for the Swedish population in particular in Brooklyn at this time, between 1870 and 1891. Many of the Swedes that were working in Brooklyn at this time were working as longshoremen, carpenters, merchants, clerks, servants, cooks. And the community itself was centered around the Cobble Hill area of Brooklyn. This is Atlantic Avenue here, and Cobble Hill is here along the western section. It's no accident that it was close to the water. As I said, many of the working class Swedes were employed as longshoremen. So this was not by accident, and of course, the Swedes come from water, they love water, they know water. So it made a lot of sense. But also to note that the western section of Atlantic Avenue during this time was known as Swedish Broadway. And in fact, there was a trolley that ran along Atlantic Avenue where the signs in the trolley were posted in Swedish, and the conductor would regularly announce that passengers were traveling through the Swedish colony. So it really does sort of give you a sense of this density in this particular area at this time of this particular demographic. I also just wanted to mention the article that I've put up here, which is from 1891, from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which focuses more on the working class population of Swedes at that time, talking about their thrift, their industriousness, that many of them come to the country with a trade so that they have been easily assimilated into New York's culture, working culture, and then also that there is a single-mindedness to this particular working class population to attain home ownership. So that the article mentions the fact that they seem to be really steadfast in this desire and success in acquiring homes despite their meager earnings. This was a subsequent article that I found from 1900 that talks about prominent Swedish business leaders and the leaders of the various charitable institutions devoted to Swedish needs. And I also wanted to mention that one of the institutions that was organized around this time, specifically in 1890, was the American Society of Swedish Engineers. And Magnus Dahlander was a co-founder of this organization, which was a merger between the Swedish Technical Society of New York and the Swedish Engineers of Philadelphia. The membership that they counted at this time were, of course, everybody who was a Swedish engineer, whether they were civil, electrical, engineering, mining, mechanical, but also building and naval architects, as well as chemists. So this is 2 years after Dahlander arrives. He's immediately getting very involved in the activities of his community. And in fact, he is the general secretary of the organization for the first 2 years and essentially writes about the activities of the group in their annual reports. So that brings us to Dahlander's work in Brooklyn. According to his memoirs, which are published in Swedish, he left the office, he left his apartment the day after he arrived in Brooklyn, clutching his drawings under his arm, and found employment 2 hours later with the Parfit Brothers architectural firm. Now, this is notable because the Parfit Brothers was, well, to use an expression, no small potatoes. They were one of the leading designers in Brooklyn during this time. They were a firm comprised of three brothers from England, Henry, Walter, and later Albert. Henry and Walter established the firm in 1875, and essentially it took off. And I just wanted to sort of highlight some of the projects. As you can see, they were working, designing row houses, apartments, firehouses, mansions, as well as commercial buildings as well. And they were also designing in a variety of styles. So here we have examples of their work designed in the Neo-Grec style, which is very popular during the 1870s. Here, the Romanesque revival style. Here is a mansion that they designed in the Queen Anne style, along with some row houses in Park Slope in the Queen Anne style. Also an apartment building, very prominent on Montague in Brooklyn Heights, and another signature townhouse that they designed in Brooklyn Heights in the Romanesque revival style. Here we see some of their church commissions. Here we see a really interesting Dutch Renaissance revival style. I did a little bit of research on the Parfit Brothers and learned that they used to give presentations to prospective clients to educate them about possibilities with respect to styles, looking at various buildings from Europe, so that they were basically educating and enticing prospective clients and showing them a variety of styles in this way. And I think, of course, it bears noting that Magnus Dahlander, coming to Brooklyn, securing this job within 2 hours of his first day was pretty important, because he would have been exposed to a real host and variety of projects that they were working on, which would have given him an understanding and appreciation of these, what were then popular styles here. The following year, Dahlander was employed in the office of P.J. Lauritzen, where he was employed as a foreman and a draftsman for $25 a week. I was not able to find out exactly why he left Parfit Brothers. Perhaps it was a pay raise, but this was also quite a prestigious firm to be with. Peter J. Lauritzen hailed from Jutland, Denmark. He was born in 1847. He came to Washington, D.C. in the late 1860s, and he worked as the supervising architect of the Treasury. Not bad for a Swede coming to America. And then following that, he became the architect of Washington in 1885. In 1883. 1883, he moved to New York and became the head of an architectural ironworks before he then established his own architectural practice. In 1885, he was awarded a very prestigious commission, which was for the Manhattan Athletic Club, unfortunately no longer here, at 45th and Madison. And 4 years later, he was awarded yet another very important commission, especially within the context of Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Union League Club, which is still standing and is a New York City landmark, in Grant Square in the Bedford section of Brooklyn. What's interesting is Dahlander was working in this office at the time he designed the Brooklyn Union League Club, and in fact, gave a presentation on this building to the American Society of Swedish Engineers in 1890. So he must have been very involved with respect to assisting in the design of this building. I also just wanted to point out, just because it's such an interesting and sort of a curiosity, on Fulton Street in downtown Brooklyn is the Vosburgh manufacturing building, which was a company that made gas lights. But so interesting, this detail, which is in cast iron, which I think sort of speaks to Lauritzen background as head of this architectural ironworks. But just the level of detail is quite fascinating. So Dahlander's arrival in Brooklyn really occurs at a signal moment in time for its development. Architectural historians Robert A.M. Stern and Gregory Gilmartin and John Massengale, in their encyclopedic New York 1900, refer to this period as the Metropolitan Age, that is between 1865 and 1940. And this is really about the age of the city and mass urbanization. Further, the authors subdivide this age into 3 eras. The cosmopolitan era between 1865 and 1890, the composite era between 1890 and 1915, and the era of convenience between 1915 and 1940. So given the fact that Dahlander was in Brooklyn for a period that coincides with both the cosmopolitan and the composite eras, I think it's instructive to sort of understand what was going on within the context of local and national design, local and national developments. So the cosmopolitan era was defined by technological innovation, such as the introduction of the passenger elevator in 1870, the introduction of electricity in 1882, the introduction of the telephone in 1896. This is also augmented by the human capital and creativity that was afforded by the enormous influx of immigrants that were coming into Brooklyn and New York at this time. John F. Sprague, writing in New York, the Metropolis, noted that the city's architecture was attributable to the diversity of immigrants who, quote, stay long enough to leave some impression of their manners and custom, which ultimately resulted in an architecture that was diverse, exotic, and beautiful, rather than moralistic and instructive. Now, this is kind of a heady concept, but I can think of no better exemplar of this exoticism and beauty than the Brooklyn Bridge. Designed by the German-born John A. Roebling, one can only imagine the impact this must have had on New Yorkers and visitors to New York at the time of its opening. That is this model of both exoticism, beauty, permanence, monumentality, in a sense, an artistic and technological masterpiece for everybody to take in and enjoy. So similarly, we shall see how this exoticism and beauty were hallmarks of Magnus Dalander's work, both in partnership with Frederick B. Langston and on his own. So in 1892, Dahlander and Frederick B. Langston formed a partnership with offices at 1082 Bedford Avenue. Langston was born into a maritime family in Jersey City in 1859. He apprenticed under architect Amsey Hill for a year before establishing his own practice in 1888. And prior to that, he had received his architectural training at Lehigh University. After the two architects took part in an architectural exhibition that was sponsored by a leading architectural trade journal, they began to receive many commissions. So this sort of initiated the practice, and the office became so busy that they ended up engaging two Finnish draftsmen to assist them. However, as Dahlander later recounted, Langston was lazy, and I was the busy bee. So the partnership did dissolve not too long after, 2 years to be exact. And in fact, Langston went on to collaborate with his brothers to invent the Langston mooring, which was a type of anchoring system for maritime vessels, which enabled him to retire from architecture and live quite comfortably before his death in 1919. So I just wanted to look a little bit at the work that they are doing together. Here we can see quite a bit of the Romanesque revival influence in these projects, with the rough-faced stone bases and these Romanesque arches. You'll notice this very wide arch. This becomes really a leitmotif for Dahlander. And in fact, my colleague Suzanne has referred to Dahlander as the master of the arch. And you do see this not only in his work in Brooklyn, but also Sweden as well. And then a pair of just stunning townhouses in Crown Heights North on St. Mark's Avenue. Also, another sort of character-defining feature of the Dahlander work are these corner rounded bays that are full height, usually crowned with a witch's hat or a bell-shaped cap. Here we can see more of really this idea of exoticism and beauty through a Queen Anne style. And in particular, this row here, located on Garfield Place in Park Slope, is an absolute marvel. The Queen Anne style was a style that was, well, first of all, it has absolutely no association with Queen Anne, the reign of Queen Anne. This was a style that was popularized by a British architect named Norman Shaw in 1858 and became very popular in New York between 1880 and 1910. Some of the hallmarks of this style are the asymmetrical massing, which you can see certainly here, not as much here, the varied roof lines, typically consisting of a mix of dormers, gables, and turrets, as well as polychromatic materials. And both of these are wonderful examples of just a whole range of masonry and terracotta put to use. I should also note that this coincides with developments in railroad transportation, which is also facilitating the transport of non-local building materials into New York. So between 1892 and 1894, Dahlander worked independently, producing designs for row houses, apartment houses, country villas, and churches. Drawings from this period also indicate that he was assisted by a draftsman named John A. Davidson, though I do not know anything about him. As you can see from these examples of his independent projects, he seems to be heavily influenced by the Romanesque revival style. This was a style that was popular in the 1880s and 1890s in New York, typified, I could mention this before, by the rough-faced stone bases, the Roman arched windows, which are often interspersed with pilasters, as well as brick corbelling, which is a sort of cantilevered stepped brick, and also matriculated cornices, which unfortunately there's not an example here, but these are really cornices that have a sort of scalloped design in brick along the roof line. But I think what's quite marvelous, besides the scale of these, which are really larger than the average row houses that we see in so many parts of Brooklyn, is just the variations within a theme, one would say, along the row that Dahlander incorporates, such as the Spanish clay-tiled oriel here, and also the very sculptural ornamentation, these bosses. Well, Robert A.M. Stern has called his row on Bainbridge Avenue a tour de force. And it is little wonder why. These 33 houses occupy an entire block front. Now, when I first visited these, and this was actually in 1999, I was under the impression that this was a pretty textbook example of a French Renaissance revival style. But then, as you look closer, what you see is what I would call the Magic of Delando, which is essentially this sort of Nordic Renaissance overlay that's going on. So whereas it's quite typical to have these gable front dormers with this very delicate treatment in the French Renaissance revival style, here you see these rather elongated projecting gargoyles coming out of the side, which I have not yet seen anywhere else in the city. Also, this wonderful turret here with the bell cap, along with the fleur-de-lis over the windows, and just magnificent. Here also just appears to be a rather sort of Nordic interpretation of a man here. And then you've got wonderful seashells and garlands, which are sort of intermingled with, you would say, Northern Italian Renaissance. But this is, again, the exoticism and beauty that I was speaking about earlier, that Dahlander is bringing to his work, really elevating the work. Here we have this pair of apartment houses. Again, the master of the arch is at play. Here we see over is this sculptural stone carving of a bear. Well, I only say that because I've never seen a bear anywhere else carved in New York, so I just think that this is also sort of a Scandinavian touch that he's adding. Not to mention that it's just the pointed arch is so interesting too, in terms of this, the point, how it leads into this. And he used this in, let's see. I'm not seeing it. I could have sworn it was in this one. Let me go back one more. No. But he uses a lion's head in another one. Just rather interesting. Here again, you can see both this kind of melding of Queen Anne style and the Romanesque revival style, and then, of course, his hallmark corner rounded bay with, in this case, these witches' hats. I would say that if you are out in Brooklyn and you would like to see sort of the best and the brightest of Dahlander, that you visit Bainbridge Avenue, as well as Decatur Street, which is an absolute marvel of architecture and ornamental design. And here you can just see sort of a glimpse of what's going on. Each of these houses is different and just mesmerizing. Dahlander also designed churches. We know that he entered a competition to design the Embury Methodist Church, but unfortunately lost out to his former employer, the Parfit brothers, who received the commission. He also designed a church in Dover, New Jersey, and we have another one that was located on Decatur Street. And I don't know if these were ever realized. I do know that his parish hall addition here for St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Clinton Hill was. So that brings us to his final partnership in the United States with Axel Hedman, a fellow Swede. And Dahlander had initially assisted Hedman with some house designs, and this coalesced into them forming a business partnership together in 1894 with an office in the Arbuckle building on Fulton Street. Hedman was born in North Shipping in 1861 and immigrated to the United States in 1880. He became an American citizen in 1901. I should also note that when I was in Sweden visiting the archives, I came across some documentation that indicated that Dahlander had also become an American citizen. Now, I can only think that because he did return to Sweden after 8 years here and lived out the rest of his years, that he must have maintained dual citizenship at that time. Axel Hedman designed hundreds of row houses, both before and after his time with Dahlander. And a large part of the firm's success was their ability to cultivate relationships with speculative row house builders. Now, it's really sort of interesting about speculative row house development during the 19th century because it coincides with the evolution of the standardization, I should say, of architectural practice during the 19th century. And what I mean by that is in the early part of the 19th century, most builders were doing the designs themselves. They were relying on architectural pattern books, and they were picking and choosing elements out of these books, which they then put together into a design. The result was certainly serviceable, but often monotonous. So what you have with the advancement of training with architects, various schools turning out architects, and also, of course, advances in construction technology, is the builders suddenly understanding the value-driven value of having an architect as part of this process. And this, of course, was an efficiency of time, as well as being able to create designs that would bring some curb appeal to prospective buyers, so that instead of these monotonous rows after rows of identical row houses, you have distinctions within the rows, yet still cohesive as a row. I apologize because I don't believe that these photos do these rows justice. And what I mean by that is when you actually go to look at these buildings in person and you really look at them, details emerge, very subtle details that otherwise you can't sort of capture from these kind of wide angle photos. But just to say that during this time, we see that they are also working in this Romanesque revival style. Also, there's a little bit of an overlay with the Renaissance revival style, which is a delicate treatment. So you have this sort of very somber treatment in the base of these buildings, but also delicate treatments with respect to the upper story ornamentation. And then, of course, the marvelous stained glass, which still exists within some of these properties. Here we have really more of the same in terms of the Romanesque and the Renaissance Revival combinations. Here we're seeing, again, the large arch creeping in. This row is rather interesting because this flats building, which is essentially a middle-class apartment house, was also designed by the team as well as the row houses next to it. So that brings us to the second era, the composite era. This is the era which truly embodied the peak of the metropolitan age, as it was marked by economic expansion and consolidation, really resulting in what has been called America's imperial age. So this economic consolidation was nowhere more apparent than in New York City, following this annexation of the 5 boroughs to form this modern-day municipality. By the mid-1890s, the vision for the city was to be a composite of many immigrant cultures that would come together in order to create a homogeneous and harmonious whole. As such, the leading designers and planners of the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 looked to the great cities of Western Europe for inspiration. And their intent was essentially to remake the American city. This resulted in the City Beautiful movement, which entailed both Beaux-Arts planning and design. The outgrowth of this event was a more classically inspired approach to architecture that was informed by symmetry, balance, and order, which contrasted with the more freer approach to architecture that was exhibited during the cosmopolitan age, or era, excuse me. So in particular, Axel Hedman was influenced by this signal event, which exerted its influence throughout the country. He designed classically inspired row houses, both with Dahlander and independently. He loved monochromatic materials, specifically limestone and white-colored brick, with certainly the reference to the White City in Chicago from the World's Fair. And he and Dahlander produced Renaissance Revival row houses that were more restrained than their Beaux-Arts counterparts at the time. But at the same time, always providing that visual interest. And what I mean by that is, when you look at these rows, you'll notice that there are differences, what we call the ABA pattern. The A, the B, the A, the rounded bay, the angled bay, the rounded bay. And then in addition to that, variations in this row in particular among the cornice line, which is kind of unusual because usually the cornice is the cohesive element in terms of the design of bringing them all together, but also in the spandrels on the second floors, and then in some cases alternating the entrance surrounds. So this is again their gloss on the classically inspired design of the time. Robert A.M. Stern and his co-authors have referred to the design trend at this time as scientific eclecticism, and that is being faithful to classically inspired principles while retaining an individuality of design, or to put it plainly, copying the effect but not the form. So this is not a faithful adherence, but one that really captures the essence of this classical inspiration. Well, we are at the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, after all. So I would be remiss if I did not at least speak a little bit to the multitude of unsung immigrant artisans who brought Magnus Dalander's designs to life. These are, of course, all of Dalander's projects, independent and in partnership. in particular the stonecutters, because their work is just so tangible, this extraordinary craftsmanship that you see when you look at these buildings. So I looked into a trade journal from 1890 and came across an article that talked about that the immigrant groups that were doing this type of work in Brooklyn at this time and leading up to this time were primarily from England, Scotland, Ireland, and Germany. I don't know how I could leave out Germany because another article talked about the Germans also being rather skillful as wood craftsmen as well, so that they were responsible for a lot of the interiors of these houses. The article also went on to talk about this concept of harvesters. That is, and they were specifically talking about the Scots. They were saying that the Scots only come to Brooklyn and New York during the building season, after which time they take their earnings and they go back to Scotland. And this, of course, did not endear them to the labor unions, who, of course, wanted a constant labor presence in the city during that time. Later articles noted that portraiture on buildings, such as busts or mascarons or caryatids, were largely done by English and Scandinavian sculptors, while many of the carvings on churches and cathedrals were done by immigrant Italian artisans, that is, both stonecutters and sculptors. And I make a distinction because there is a distinction when you read sort of the articles of this time talking about how the stonecutters are doing sort of most of the ornamental work on these buildings versus the sculptors that are doing really sort of the very complex sculpture that you will see on a building. I also just wanted to say that this does not, of course, account for the successive waves of immigrant artisans from other countries that most definitely made their imprint on New York and Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island and the Bronx through their work. Because there were, of course, subsequent groups that also brought their traditions here as well. So I just wanted to close with some of Dahlander's schematic drawings that I was able to find at his archives in his hometown of Setter. It's still unclear to me whether most of these projects actually got built. And that is because there's no date on any of them. Sometimes there's a label which will say country house for R. Rothschild, but beyond that, you're not really getting a location or anything. But we do know that this was a proposed commercial alteration for a building in Lower Manhattan. This building had no identifying information at all, but it looks to me like it could have been, well, pick and choose. Armory, police station, fort, I don't know. These three were country villas. This was a plan, and it says on the drawing, for Magnus Dahlander, signed by Magnus Dahlander. Dahlander actually owned property in the Morris Park section of Queens that he called Villa Sturgeon, where he designed his house. Now, I looked on Street View just to see what was there today, and lo and behold, the house is a very sad, compromised version of another plan that he had for this house. So this must have been one of his iterations, but he ended up going with a different design for the house. And then this last one, which absolutely baffled me, is a proposal for a synagogue in New Haven, Connecticut. So his tentacles definitely extended beyond the New York metropolitan area. But I think, like his realized projects, these schematic proposals really highlight the range of creativity that Dahlander brought to all of his projects, and really, in a sense, helping to transform Brooklyn from brownstone Brooklyn, from an unremarkable suburb during the mid to late 19th century, into a mesmerizing experience that still can continue to fascinate us today. So I thank you very much. So I would be happy to take any questions if anyone has. Yes?
Showed two buildings at 100 and 110 Park Place in Brooklyn, and you said it was the neo-Brecht style. Could you comment on what that is?
Yes. It's a heavy file. Almost there. So what's interesting about this row in particular is that it is not a brownstone row. So many of the neo-Grec row houses are clad in brownstone. This was a style that grew popular during the 1870s. It is most definitely a response to the industrial age and the availability of steam-powered technology that allowed for the carving of detailing on these houses in a much more expedited fashion than would otherwise occur with stone carvers. The style itself is exemplified by what are really abstracted elements of Greek revival. So they are just very sort of streamlined. Often you'll find the pediments over the doors are actually flush with the facades, as well as in the upper stories over the windows. Also, there are sill courses, which are essentially bands that will connect the lintels and the sills that are flush on these buildings. Yes?
You showed a church in Clinton Hill. I think it's down the street from my brother's. It's right there somewhere. Which one is it?
This is St. Mary's Episcopal Church. Yeah. Yes, Jim.
Greg, this was absolutely incredible, the research you've done here, and I think the insight you've given us on the architecture in that period, particularly in Brooklyn, just amazing.
Thank you.
Could we ask you where Dahlander lived in Brooklyn when he was working? And I asked that in part because there's a number of his works that you cited on Sterling Place and Park Place. I have a vague recollection that at the intersection of one of them and Washington Avenue is the old Swedish hospital.
Yes.
So did the community move off Atlantic Avenue to that area?
Well, I don't know where Dahlander lived. I do know that he did own this property on 161st Street in this Morris Park. This is a former neighborhood in Queens, Morris Park. But I don't know whether he lived there or not. I don't know where he lived. But my translator, Harold Henriksen in Sweden, had said that in his memoirs, he talks about Villa Sturgen, this house in Queens, extensively, as if to suggest that he probably lived there. So I thought that was kind of interesting that he would have been commuting at that time. Yes?
What do we call the area called Moores Park now? Because there is no Moores Park.
No, there isn't.
That I know.
No, I need to get back to you on that one.
Street,
Yes,
around Jamaica.
yes, yeah, yeah.
Were you able to find out why he went back to Sweden so soon?
Well, my understanding was opportunity, yes. And I also understand that it was opportunity, not opportunity, but at the time in Sweden when he left, that there was some sort of economic recession going on that prompted him to actually come to the United States. But pretty good that he landed this job as the county architect upon his return. That would have been prestigious. And he also sat on a jury that awarded public commissions to various firms in Örebro, as well as did his own designs in Örebro. So he was sort of operating on all engines. Yeah. Yes, Victoria.
I was just going to mention about the community someone had asked about. The Scandinavian community tends to move, and it goes up to southern Brooklyn, all the Scandinavian community. So you'll see, if you follow the history of a church or institution, you kind of see how it moves. And then when they start to have country hall, which is very common in different parts of Long Island, Pennsylvania, whatever, you'll see they also take the names sometimes from Brooklyn, from those place names, and they sometimes make those permanent settlements. But you also see there is a Swedish group that lives in the Bronx as well. Because they still have a big social club up there.
Yeah. Great. Justin.
And to add to that, there used to be a Swedish part of Harlem. I love the Parfit brothers, and I've always loved the Parfit brothers. And I was surprised to find the connection with Dahlander to the Parfit brothers, and also to see the Tree Studios of Chicago.
Yes.
Do you know if he actually was involved in the creation of that? It's a remarkable building.
Yeah, I know. Let me get back to that one.
Yeah. What do you see? It's wonderful.
This is what he is referring to. So this is in 1899, which postdates his time with the Parfit brothers.
Okay.
But it is a fascinating project. I had never heard of it before, but I don't know, have you been?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
It's
there you
a
go.
Wonderful complex, wonderful complex.
Great. Anybody else? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. We should work our way around. So we'll work our way around.
The gentleman mentioned Chicago, right? Did Dahlander and Axel Hedman ever crisscross or meet Daniel Burnham?
Not to my knowledge, no.
That would have been a nice collaboration,
Yes,
I think.
it would have. Yeah. But he certainly fits right into that period.
Through all your research, did you come across construction plans for any of his buildings, as far as architectural plans?
Yes,
You did.
lots.
Lots. And, I mean, were they,
In Sweden, and I photographed them. And what was interesting was a lot of the ones that I'd surveyed, and I have to confess that I have not surveyed all of Dahlander's work in Brooklyn. If you want to speak to somebody who has, we have Morgan Muncie here, who leads walking tours in Brooklyn of Dahlander's work in particular. So what was interesting when I got to Sweden was I found a lot of elevations that pertain to the row houses that I had not actually surveyed. So it was interesting. It just only augmented the list that I had. I did come across a written project list of Dahlander's, which there was a total of 65 projects, but I haven't, they don't give you he didn't give exact addresses. He would say the south side of, between the intersection of, so I wasn't sure exactly all the time whether or not they were aligned with the information that I had, and also how comprehensive that list was.
I was wondering if the existence of the renderings for the churches and the Manhattan Project have to do with the economic boost for that kind of project. Why wouldn't there be renderings of the single-family houses in Brooklyn and the row houses, renderings?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just clarify that I was able to come across those. I don't have them featured in this presentation, but absolutely, there were loads of row house renderings. All the way down, of course, to the details that I was showing you in terms of the ornamentation. In Sweden, correct. Yeah. By the way, how many of you are from Brooklyn? Thank you. Thank you so much for coming out. And also, how many of you live in a Dahlander house? All right, let's hear it for the Dahlander house. Terrific. Great. 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 Here we go again. 319. Do you remember what slide this was? Was this? Okay. Up here. Okay. All right. Terrific. Terrific. I see. Terrific. Yes, that's right. Right. Okay, sir.
Was the focus of Dahlander solely exterior, or did he also have significant input on the interior design of these buildings?
He was involved in the interior designs as well, yes. And there are interior plans as well in the archives in Sweden. Yeah. Yeah.
Are they the townhouses? Are they for one family, or they were for one?
They were originally built for one family.
For one family.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. One more.
Just one quick question. On the Artisan slide, on the bottom right is a really beautiful white stone building. I'm just curious if you know where that is.
Okay. I believe it's Decatur Place. Decatur Avenue. All right. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, before you begin, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, I want to say how delighted we are to have Gregory Dietrich speak here this evening on this fascinating topic and really such extensive research. And I know many of you here are familiar with brownstone Brooklyn, but for me, finding out about the Metropolitan age was a revelation, and the Swedish and the immigration. So it really was a wonderful and fascinating lecture. Thank you very much, Gregory.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we would like to present you with a memento of the evening, and to do so is our Executive Director, Victoria Dengel.
And Gregory, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, we express our gratitude to you, Gregory Dietrich, of Gregory Dietrich Preservation Consulting for Dahlander and Brooklyn, for your participation in the General Society Artisan Lecture Series. Thank you so much, Gregory. Thank you. Thank you. And as we always, yes. Oh. And as we always say, we never like to let go of our lecturers, and so we have made you an honorary member of the library. And all right, so there you go.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. And we want to see more.
And finally, presented by Meg Stanton, our program assistant, a little memento of the evening.